I'm intrigued by this notion of skepticism of telepathy because there's so much acceptance of other things like homeopathy and all the things that are skewered in the bad science column in The Guardian every week. So how come they get more play than they should, and people will take scientific bullshit from homeopathy vendors, but they won't accept physical results from you?
I think it depends who I'm talking to. I give seminars, I'm giving one in a couple of months' time, at Chris French's department at Goldsmiths College London, he's the main professor of skepticism in Britain. He's professor of anomalous psychology. And this is one of the main academic hotbeds of skepticism. I give talks there, people listen, we have reasonable discussions, and they know about the results. And very few of the people there exhibit this kind of prejudiced skepticism that I encounter all too often, a kind of ignorant, bigoted type of skepticism. I think one of the reasons that there's so much of that is that people who are really skeptical have such a strong belief that they know in advance the evidence must be wrong. You say, if you believe it's impossible, then if I come along and say, here's results that show it's possible, either it proves I'm a fool, I've done the experiment so badly or incompetently, I've got false positive results and haven't been smart enough to see it, or I'm a fraud, I'm trying to deceive you and the world. And so the instant reaction is one of hostility and accusing people of being fools or frauds. Richard Dawkins, who's a very smart man, is, in this area, not very smart at all. He's a very bigoted skeptic. And he came to interview me for his most recent TV series in Britain. He had one against religion, a two-part polemic called The Root of All Evil. And his most recent series was called Enemies of Reason. It was about research in parapsychology and alternative medicine. They didn't tell me it was called Enemies of Reason beforehand when they asked me to take part, but I've had enough experience of these negative media treatments, and I'd seen his previous series, that I was very suspicious, and I said I'd only agree to take part if it's a genuine scientific discussion about evidence, and if he's really open to discussing the evidence. Otherwise, there's no point. And they gave me and I said I want it in writing. They gave me a written assurance that this was the case. So I agreed to meet him, and he came to see me. And we started off, there was a handheld camera, they put us facing each other. And he started off by saying, he said, I dare say we agree about quite a number of things, Rupert. He said, but let me tell you what worries me about you. And I said, okay, what worries me about me? And he said, what worries me about you is you're prepared to believe almost anything, and science should be based on the minimum number of beliefs. So I said, well, okay, well, let me tell you what worries me about you. I said, you come across as prejudiced and bigoted, and I think you give science a bad name. So we didn't get very far with that conversation. So then he said, the trouble with telepathy is that people are, then he said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. It's a standard skeptical slogan. So I said, well, what's the extraordinary claim? I said, the majority of sane, normal people in Britain believe they've had telepathic experiences. In that sense, it's not extraordinary, it's ordinary. Most people have had it. You're making the claim that most people are deluded about their own experience. Where's your extraordinary evidence for that? He couldn't produce any at all. He just said, oh, people have a very false sense of statistics and probability and stuff, generic arguments. Then I said, well, look, okay, why don't we get down to the evidence and actually discuss the evidence, which is why we've met. And he said, I don't want to talk about the evidence. And I said, well, why not? And he said, there isn't time. And I said, well, we've got plenty of time. He said, it's too complicated. And I said, no, it isn't. He said, anyway, it's not what this program's about. And so I said, well, he didn't know. I'd sent him my papers, 3 or 4 papers, 2 weeks before, so he could look at them. He hadn't looked at them. And he was just trying to trap me into saying something silly and then put that on TV.
Right.
So I said, okay, well then there's been a misunderstanding, because I said I didn't want to take part in yet another low-grade debunking program. He said, it's not a low-grade debunking program, it's a high-grade debunking program. So then the producer said, cut, and the cameras stopped rolling. And so then I said to the director, is this a debunking program or not? He said, yes, it's another Richard Dawkins polemic. And I said, then you're here under false pretenses, because you told me it was about evidence. He said, I didn't. I said, well, your assistant did. He said, can you prove it? And I said, yes. And I produced the email with this. And I said, I'm afraid there's been a serious misunderstanding. He said, well, I'm afraid I have to agree with you. That she should never have told you that. That's not what it's about. It's a polemic. I said, well, I'm going to have to ask you to leave my house. And I didn't sign a release. I wouldn't actually mind if all that was put on the TV, but I've written up an account of this. It's on my website. It's been published in several British journals. If you want to read the details, it's on an account called Richard Dawkins Comes to Call. But that's an example, you see, of someone with a huge media presence, an enormous intellectual prestige, because a lot of people think he's an incredibly smart guy who speaks for science. In this area, whatever his virtues as a geneticist, he doesn't know anything about it. He's speaking from prejudice and ignorance. And that's a very bad thing to do if you are, as he is, professor of public understanding of science. It doesn't further a public understanding of science. And that, I'm afraid, is why the debate on this is not often based on evidence and very often based on prejudice, stereotypes, and ignorance.
4 basic rules for debunkers, which I have found. We need to be cognizant of this. First, don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. Second, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Third, if you can't attack the data, attack the people. And fourth, do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble and nobody will know the difference anyway. So that's the kind of climate we're in here.
My name is Dr. Eugene Mallove. I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the international science and energy magazine called Infinite Energy, published in New Hampshire, but now in 38 countries. Also, I'm the director of the New Energy Research Laboratory, which is part of Infinite Energy magazine. The actual corporation in the state of New Hampshire, right near Concord, is called Cold Fusion Technology Incorporated. Magazine has been in existence since 1995. I have 2 engineering degrees from MIT, a Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Astronautical Engineering in 1969. I have a master's degree from MIT, also in Aeronautical Astronautical Engineering in 1970. I also have a doctorate, SCD, Doctorate in Engineering, from Harvard University School of Public Health and Environmental Health Sciences, 1975. I was the chief science writer at the MIT News Office when the cold fusion story out of Utah broke on March 23rd, 1989. And I was at MIT, my alma mater, as serving proudly as the chief science writer in the news office. I encountered cold fusion and my entry into what might be called today, or is called today, the new energy area, because I was the chief science writer at the MIT News Office. And it was essential at the time when Drs. Pons and Fleischman on March 23rd made their announcement at the University of Utah that they had created apparently a source of energy, they said, that had more energy coming out than in a jar, vessel of heavy water on which they had taken careful measurements. They thought that the amount of heat coming out was so large that it had to be a nuclear source. They were excellent chemists, world class. They could not see anything else but a nuclear explanation, even though they didn't have proof of it, other than the magnitude of the excess heat and some preliminary indications of nuclear products. That's how it began. What we really had was a threat to the scientific establishment, even if it were perceived, as it was then and even today, as a bogus discovery, not a real discovery, not good science, bad science, false data. Even though that was and is on the minds of the hot fusion physicists today and the high energy physicists, the threat of it even being implied as real and having monies, shall we say, being diverted from their favored programs, and that was a threat, no question. There was an actual threat of that happening. It was real, overwhelmingly compelling, as I said, in Fire from Ice. It was real. Now it's 100% certain. In fact, what Pons and Fleischman found was only the tip of an iceberg. And this is a huge controversy, one of the largest, maybe most intense controversies in the history of science, in the sense that it's occurring in the modern age, well documented in video and print media and books and everything. huge quantities of technical literature published by the proponents, a much smaller amount by the people who found so-called negative results. And the intensity of this controversy certainly equals controversies of the past, like the Galileo Copernican revolution. Two very dramatic events occurred at MIT while the cold fusion story was evolving. Remember, March 23rd, 1989, the announcement. But within weeks, the hot fusion people were going into action behind closed doors to disprove them. I inadvertently was looking through some piles of paper that had been given to me in a casual manner by all these hot fusion physicists as they were trying to do their calorimetric repeat of the Pons-Fleischmann experiment. And to my utter astonishment, I can remember sitting at my desk in my study and actually seeing these two sheets of paper, wads of paper, reports, one dated July 10th, 1989, and another dated July 13th, 3 days apart. The difference between July 10th and 13th was dramatic. And my initial reaction was, oh, here's in July 10th, control experiment, light water, heavy water, the real Pons-Fleischmann experiment, showing in the raw data excess heat, what looked like excess heat on the graph. Whether it was correct or not is not important, but it looked on the graph like, oh, gee, that's dominantly positive. One would conclude from that data alone, gee, if we get that on the experiment, that's exciting, okay? But then on the 13th, it was shifted completely. It was altered. They did some standard averaging, which was appropriate, that is in time blocks, but the level of the signal had been utterly changed. And I was stunned. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It looked like monkey business to me at the time, and it has turned out to be exactly that. It was a lower echelon person in the Plasma Fusion Center at MIT, one of the 16 authors of a scientific paper done under Department of Energy contract that had altered data. And that data is scientific fraud, as far as I'm concerned, and many other people are concerned. It was represented as a negative result when it was positive. Didn't prove cold fusion, even if the positive result was a legitimate positive. But the representation of the altered data as a negative was clear fraud. No question. It's been referred to legal authorities in the government. I asked for a review at MIT, got nowhere. If this type of manipulation had occurred in any legitimate research area, such as cancer research, AIDS research, global warming research, anything that's accepted as reasonable to be researching, and this kind of shifting were determined in a normal university setting, the people would lose their jobs, they wouldn't be in science. And yet, these people today, their data is used today, to year 2000, and all before, to reject patents. It's not the only thing they use to reject patents of American citizens and other people applying for cold fusion patents. But the MIT data is held up, Caltech data is held up, Harwell Laboratory in England data held up. It's a travesty, a very amazing thing. We know for a fact today that the cold fusion, low energy nuclear reactions are real. It's a class of reactions of nuclear, non-dangerous reactions producing dominantly heat but also nuclear changes. Very beneficial type of powerful reaction. That is a commercially emerging technology in the hands of a number of companies. It's difficult technology, but it will, under the proper circumstances of proper patenting and money and what have you, it will emerge as a universal energy source. And I just want to say that at least one of the reactions is indeed cold fusion. Literally the joining of two heavy hydrogen nuclei to form helium-4. This has been demonstrated repeatedly. Dr. Les Case, MIT graduate, his process has been repeated at SRI International. There is absolutely no doubt about this. And what that means is that in 1 cubic kilometer of ocean, if you fuse all the heavy hydrogen, which is just 1/6500th of that cubic kilometer of ocean, that would equal the oil energy of combusting all the known oil reserves on Earth. So for all practical purposes, we know today, scientifically, in a very careful manner, supported by a mountain of additional supporting evidence, that that at least is possible in principle and nearing commercial application. I believe that cold fusion has opened my eyes to yet other possibilities. It definitely has opened my eyes to other possibilities, and these possibilities have now essentially come to become, in my mind, based on my evaluation of a number of devices I have seen or inferred or studied, without getting into details of what these devices are. In a few instances, I can say there are clearly over-unity electromagnetic devices, things that produce more electrical energy out than in. We are not in Kansas any longer. This is spectacular new physics. It indicates that some rather dramatic cracks exist in the foundations of physics. Electromagnetic theory will require radical revision. There has been an extraordinary abrogation of basic legal responsibility at the Patent Office, as an example, and at the Department of Energy on the matter of cold fusion. Cold fusion patents have not been approved. Okay. The only way of approving any patent that resembles cold fusion is to eliminate the words cold fusion or anything like it. Certain people have done that and succeeded. Okay, the Patterson power cell is one such example, and there was an age clause acceleration because of the age of Dr. Patterson that helped him, and it was through a different art group at the Patent Office that helped him also. But dominantly, if the patent goes through a certain gentleman at the Patent Office today, whose name is Harvey, he will reject all such patents. They will not get through. American citizens are being denied their constitutional rights in this particular case. There is no question about it. We have a complete audit trail on that. Numerous inventors can show us the sheaves of not press releases and newspaper clips from 1989 showing the failure to produce reliable results, and that's supposedly disproving Pons and Fleischmann. Therefore, the inventor is being rejected on the basis of newspaper accounts. Also, the MIT negative experiment, so-called negative experiment, is introduced. No matter what affidavits as to its invalidity are put forward for courts and so forth. Yes, there is serious criminal activity going on that ultimately must be rooted out if the cold fusion new energy revolution, at least as far as hydrogen energy, that is advanced hydrogen, anomalous physics energy is concerned. If it doesn't get rooted out, you will not be able to have a commercial infrastructure. The field of cold fusion has been marginalized by the establishment by creating certain myths about it, and pejorative terminology being used, which is highly inappropriate, has no bearing at all on what's being done, called pathological science, junk science, weird science, voodoo science now is coming up from a certain individual at the University of Maryland. And it's just basically name-calling. They no longer look at the data. Of course, they never really looked at the data. They had a bad frame of reference to begin with. They said it must work like hot fusion. Well, this was in a solid state. It's just like saying the equivalent of demanding that cold fusion works like hot fusion is like saying a transistor works like a radio tube. It's idiotic. It's stupid. It makes no sense. And yet that's what was demanded. So they made straw men. There must be this product or this radiation, or we're not going to believe it. There are prominent cold fusion critics who have established a very strong position. They have put their foot in their mouth, so to speak, and they find it very difficult, if not impossible, to adjust their thinking. They can't admit they were wrong. Perhaps at some level they have a subconscious fear that they're wrong, but they think they can get away with it now by continuing to act as though it doesn't exist. Much has happened after the Wright brothers airplane flew, and there was very much controversy about that from 1903 to 1908. One prominent critic who said it would never fly, never be real, could never be done. Simon Newcomb, the astronomer at the time, he poo-pooed it even after he said, oh yes, well, I guess they really do have it after all, but it won't have passengers, it won't be practical, and so forth. Yeah, this whole litany has occurred many times in other controversies. This one is particularly intense because of the threat to academic wisdom. There's nothing worse, I've found, than suggesting to academic physicists in particular, and academics in general, that they are not only wrong, but disastrously wrong, catastrophically wrong, and that once they are proved and shown in public to be the fools that they are and the bad actors that they are, there's possibly going to be some punishment for them in terms of loss of prestige and what have you. That's why they're resisting.
One of the discoveries that emerged out of modern quantum theory is that so-called empty space isn't really empty at all. It's actually full of energy. So instead of being like kind of a quiet, empty lake, it's more like the froth at the base of a waterfall or something. And this energy is basically electromagnetic in nature, and the energy density is quite high. In fact, it's so high that when it was first discovered mathematically, it was thought to be some kind of artifact of the mathematics. But then as time went on, there were even Nobel Prize winning experiments that showed that this energy in so-called empty space was really there. We don't usually notice it because it's so homogeneously distributed. It'd sort of be like sitting in a bathtub with at exactly your body temperature. You might not notice the water. But under certain circumstances, it can be disturbed or perturbed, and then it has effects. As I mentioned, some effects on atomic emission, for example, is what eventually ended up in a Nobel Prize for Willis Lamb of Yale University, and it's called the Lamb shift. And this is a recognition that, in fact, this energy disturbs atoms, so atoms aren't sitting in a void, they're sitting in the sea of energy. So once quantum theorists realized that energy was there, the next question was, well, is there any way to tap it? And it was thought originally that probably not. It might be like trying to tap the heat energy around us. And you can quickly prove for thermodynamic reasons that it'll take more energy to tap it than you'd get out of it, so you don't come out ahead. But back in about 1984, a researcher at Hughes Laboratory by the name of Robert Forward showed that there was a particular effect called the Casimir effect, which demonstrated that in fact this energy could be tapped. Well, when you go to look at the numbers, you find out that there's enough energy in the volume of a coffee cup to, say, evaporate all the world's oceans if you could get it all of it. So this raised the issue among theorists. Well, can we manipulate this energy? Could we tap it for spaceflight application, for example? And there are a couple ways to go. Could we get propulsion out of it? Could we use it as an energy source? And so these are the areas that modern theorists are looking at. But one of the more interesting aspects is that if in fact it does look like there's a route from here to there, then we consider the possibility that, well, maybe there are other civilizations who've been down this track ahead of us. And so it opens up the possibility that you can't reject the possibility of, for example, ET visitation out of hand. Usually here, where Einstein said you can't go faster than the speed of light. Well, that's something out of special theory of relativity, and it really is that you can't take an object and speed it up and then through the light barrier, because it would take an infinite amount of energy and mass to do it. But it turns out it's a faulty conclusion to say, therefore, you can't go faster than the speed of light, because once you get into general relativity, you have some options. The options are to change the properties of space itself, so that locally, the velocity of light is engineered to be faster than the usual value. The implication then is, well, if you can manipulate this zero-point energy C, get it out of the way, then if something tried to accelerate you, it would be easy. You would have no, quote, inertia. It'd be, rather than using humongous amounts of energy to try to propel you through this tremendous force drag that you get from the vacuum fluctuations, you could throw BBs out the back, I suppose, and take off like a shot. And so, in fact, the Air Force was sufficiently interested in that they set up a program called mass modification, in which I and my colleagues were interviewed to find out all the details of our modeling inertia as a vacuum fluctuation phenomena that might in principle be manipulated, to see if there was a possibility in some far distant future of reducing the inertia of a spaceship so that ordinary propulsive means could be used with relatively low energy requirements. And so they did a year-long study and went around to various universities and laboratories and asked people to tell them about experiments they might be able to do to determine whether our model was correct. So again, there's another indication that these are not just fringe scientists with science fiction ideas, but that basically these are kind of mainstream ideas being published in mainstream physics journals and being taken seriously by mainstream military and NASA type funders. Here at the Institute for Advanced Studies, one of our main interests is exploring the possibility of tapping or mining this vacuum fluctuation energy, zero-point energy. By the way, we call it zero point because even if you froze the universe down all the way down to absolute zero, where most motion would be frozen out, this energy would still be there. It's a very fundamental kind of energy. But we're looking to see if we can extract it for many uses, not just spaceflight application. I routinely make presentations and briefings to various branches of the government. I've been taken out on aircraft carriers by the Navy and shown what it is that we have to replace if we have new energy sources to provide new fuel methods. Of course, NASA is funding some of these breakthrough propulsion physics ideas. The Air Force, various labs in the Air Force are pursuing fundamental studies on these kind of exotic ideas. So there is a lot of government interest. It's getting to the point where modern theoretical physicists are loath to rule out any possibility. I mean, now we're talking about parallel universes and membranes of many dimensions, and I mean, the physics is just getting as wild as it can possibly be. And sandwiched in among all those alternative possibilities is the possibility that some of these concepts might actually play a role in spaceflight application, where civilizations, ourselves in the future, or maybe more advanced ET civilizations at present, could perhaps travel long distances in relatively short times. Of course, we see claims, and not just among the public, but among military pilots and good observers, typically in the military, that there appear to be something like craft flying around with anomalous behavior.
As a retired nuclear physicist who has been studying the evidence about UFOs since 1958, and since 1967 has given well over 700 lectures in all 50 states, 10 Canadian provinces, and 18 other countries, I have reached 4 major conclusions. 1, the evidence is overwhelming that Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underline 10 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. Don't care about them. 2, there is no doubt that a small number of people within governments, both in the United States and overseas, have been actively covering up the truth about these visits. There really is a cosmic Watergate. 3, there are no good arguments against these conclusions, only people who haven't studied the relevant evidence. And 4, flying saucer visitations and the cosmic Watergate represent the biggest story of the millennium. And I should say that I prefer the term flying saucer because all flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. All great-grandfathers are men. Not all men are great-grandfathers. I'm interested in the flying saucers, not the UFOs. The basis for these conclusions: A, there are at least 5 large-scale scientific studies which provide substantial evidence. These include Project Blue Book Special Report number 14, the largest study ever done for the United States Air Force, covering more than 3,200 cases with more than 200 charts, tables, graphs, and maps. It is quality evaluation, cross-comparison between unknowns and knowns. The official press release lied about the data. I'll document that in a minute. It is almost never referenced by UFO debunkers. Dr. Carl Sagan, we were classmates at the University of Chicago, claimed there are interesting UFO sightings that are not reliable, and reliable UFO sightings that are not interesting. But there are no cases that are both reliable and interesting. This statement was not backed up by reference to data, but is directly contradicted by the Blue Book Special Report 14 data. It was found that the more reliable the case, the more likely to be unexplainable. United States Air Force Secretary Donald Quarles, in the very widely distributed press release when the 1955 study was completed, flat out lied. It's a strong statement, and I'm sorry to make it, but it's true. He stated, quote, "We believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available." The fact of the matter in the report that he was talking about is that the unknowns comprise 21.5% of the cases, completely separate from the 9.3% listed as insufficient information. The 3% number was a lie. Furthermore, a statistical comparison of the unknowns and knowns showed that the probability that the unknowns were just misknowns was less than 1%. It must further be noted that the press release did not give the title of the report or the company that did the work, Battelle Memorial Institute. If they'd given the title, surely some newsman would have said, "Hey, what happened to reports 1 through 13? Had never heard about them." The correct answer, had it been given, would have been that they were all classified. It's a very valuable source of information, this report. It's funny how the debunkers never talk about it. Another primary source of valuable data, which should be of interest to you all, are the congressional hearings of July 29th, 1968, which included testimony from 12 scientists. The most important paper was by Dr. James E. McDonald, professor of physics at the University of Arizona. He had talked to 500 witnesses, but he presented 41 outstanding cases, including multiple witness radar visual sightings, sightings by pilots, by astronomers, by meteorologists. He noted physical trace cases, of which by now more than 5,000 have been collected by Ted Phillips from 95 countries. They get dull. Same thing was happening all over the world. Saucer is seen on the ground. It leaves. They find physical changes. Happens here. It happens there. It happens everywhere. 1/6 of those cases involved reports of small beings associated with the craft while it was on the ground. One of the contributors was Dr. J. Allen Hynek, chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern University, and for 20 years, United States Air Force scientific consultant to Project Blue Book. His book, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, should be required reading by anybody who's going to talk about flying saucers, especially negatively. According to another source here, according to a special UFO subcommittee of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, world's largest group of space scientists, 30% of the 117 cases studied by the University of Colorado, government-sponsored study in the late 60s, and discussed in the Condon report, Edward U. Condon, could not be identified. And yet the headline said, "Scientific study shows no UFOs." Totally untrue. There's a 2-volume report called The UFO Evidence, which has loads of data, hundreds of cases that couldn't be identified. There's also the Cometa report from France, which goes into numerous excellent officially involved cases in France. There are a dozen PhD theses about UFOs. One of them demonstrating how poor the press coverage has been. I haven't seen one about coverage by the scientific community or coverage by the political committee. That's another story. Anybody need a PhD thesis topic? There's two good ones. Also, a third one, the will not to believe on the part of scientists. It's a sickness, a disease, if you will, infecting people who think they know all there is to know and don't. A really bad example of bias and ignorance appeared in Astronomy magazine this month, May 2013, by Dr. Phil Plait. He does a blog, The Bad Astronomy. The title of the article, believe it or not, is The Science Behind UFOs. It's a cover story. He somehow manages to mention none of the 5 large-scale scientific studies that I've just talked about, or any of the 5,000 physical trace cases, or any multiple witness radar visual cases, or abductions, nor advanced technology studies at national labs and in industry showing trips to nearby stars in reasonable round-trip times using fusion propulsion are feasible. I worked on fusion back in the early 60s. And to give you a form of reference, every star in the universe or multiverse produces its energy by nuclear fusion. That's what H-bombs are all about. And a good demonstration of the atom and the UFO together, if you will, is that in a very short period, we managed to go from a 10-ton blockbuster, World War II, 1945, took a big B-29 to carry it. That was in 1944. In 1945, the first A-bomb, 15,000 tons of TNT, not 10. 7 years later, which is nothing, cost a lot of money, we set off the first fusion device, an H-bomb, called Mike, incidentally. It released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. So you go from 10 to 15,000 to 10 million tons. And the Russians sent off one that was 50 million tons of TNT. The point is, we know how to get to the stars if we want to spend the money. I'm not saying it's the ultimate technology. I'm saying scientific progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. You have to change how you do things. And you know, what gets to me, having worked on fusion propulsion, fission propulsion, nuclear reactors for space applications, and all the rest of this, is that we tend to forget that if you make enough stupid assumptions, you can prove almost anything is impossible. One quick example, one astronomer in 1941, he was fed up with all the science fiction stuff about going to the moon. That was nonsense, he said. So he published a scientific, in quotes, paper calculating the required initial launch weight of a rocket able to get a man to the moon and back. Legitimate question, how big is it got to be? Pages of equations, he concluded it'd have to weigh 1 million tons. He was off by a factor of 300 million. Proving if you make enough stupid assumptions, you can prove anything is impossible. So we have reason to be very careful when somebody says something is impossible.
One thing I want to go into just very quickly is the key role that control systems play within the media and the scientific community. Now this sort of surprises a lot of people, and some people are not surprised. First, let's deal with science. One thing you have to remember about science is that scientists are humans first and scientists second, right? All of us. And there are scientists who pose as objective scientific folks who are on the payroll of various agencies. For example, in this cache of documents I received, there's a very famous astronomer, astrophysicist at Harvard named Dr. Donald Menzel. And Menzel was the chief UFO debunker who went around telling people none of this existed. in the 1960s and all through that era. And he was on many panels, and he was the person who would look at evidence and then say, not true, not true, not true. It turned out, I have a document from the CIA where it talks about their contract with Dr. Donald Menzel at Harvard, and it said, but it cannot be acknowledged that he is being paid by us because the public needs to believe that he's an objective scientist telling the public from the perch of respectability at Harvard that this isn't true. So until the time of his death, this wasn't known. Now, in this cache of documents I got in 1994, officially released by the CIA, the provenance of this document is not in question. It names him. So just extrapolate that out, how easy it is to do that. Same thing with a guy named Professor Condon. Professor Condon was the head of the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado that had a contract in 1969 to look into UFOs so that the Air Force could determine whether to close Project Blue Book or not. Project Blue Book was actually a public relations stunt, mostly, to collect information from the public because there was so much outcry from the public of sightings and things that had happened, and the public, particularly Congressman Gerald Ford at the time, was furious that they were debunking events that had happened in Michigan that his constituents said were absolutely right there, here, E.T. craft right here. And Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who later came clean, who's also an astrophysicist, made the famous comment that it was swamp gas. And later, of course, he said, we knew it wasn't swamp gas, we knew it was E.T. craft, and he left Project Blue Book as their chief consultant and started the Center for UFO Studies there in Chicago. But Professor Condon, around this time, was asked to head up an objective scientific committee to look into whether there was any veracity to UFOs. There was a lot of publicity around it. And like all government committees, it's always, when they form a committee, they already have it, it's a done deal. It's just window dressing. So he headed up this committee, a lot of scientific people, and Dr. Robert Wood, a Cornell PhD, worked for McDonnell Douglas, now part of Boeing. And actually, Dr. Wood, who is one of our Disclosure Project witnesses, told me, and it's in his very lengthy testimony I have. You have to understand I have hundreds of hours of this kind of testimony on videotape. When he was working for McDonnell Douglas, old man McDonald himself asked him to look into UFOs and gather evidence. And so he began to do this. And he discovered a number of things. That A, they were real. B, they were interplanetary. C, they were using a type of gravity-controlled propulsion. And D, most interestingly, in many of the things that he looked into, he found that the ETs had electronic devices that were what I call technology-assisted consciousness and consciousness-assisted technologies, meaning that there was a trans-dimensional nexus between the electronics of these communication devices. I mean, you know, this goes at the speed of light. It's just junk, really. It's 1800s technology, and, you know, it's the Morse code. No offense, Apple. But they had technologies that interfaced seamlessly with electronics that would pick up directed, intended thought, and which is absolutely true. And actually, the founder of Facebook, Zuckerberg, started talking about a thought switch to interface with computers. I don't know if he's been reading my material, but anyway, I started writing about that in 1990, 1991. And when Dr. Wood saw my comprehensive assessment of the UFO subject, which was written in 91, it got kind of moved through the agency and the aerospace community. And I was just starting this project, very obscure at that time, just this country doctor in North Carolina rattling around in an ER. And it made its way over to McDonnell Douglas, and I got this phone call from Dr. Wood, and he said, "You have no idea how right you are. How do you know this?" I said, "Well, I've had contact, and it's quite obvious. I mean, if you're any thinking person, you're not dealing with electronics that are at the speed of light or travel. That's the speed of light. It's too slow. Because some of these are from other galaxies, like the picture we have of that one ET that's from Andromeda, 2.5 million light years from here. You know, they're not getting here at the speed of light. It'd take 2.5 million years to get here. So he said, well, I really want to meet with you at some point. So we kept in this relationship, and he eventually told me that when he was doing this work for McDonnell Douglas in the 60s, that he was put on the Condon Committee because they thought, because he was a very prestigious aerospace guy at a major aerospace company, that he would go along with the debunking whitewash of the Condon Committee. And Dr. Wood was someone who started bringing in boatloads of evidence. And it was turning the committee to the fact, no, these are absolutely real. So Professor Condon went to Old Man McDonald, head of McDonnell Douglas Aerospace, and said, you fire that son of a bitch so I get him off this committee. And Mr. McDonald said, no, I'm not going to fire him. He's a very good man. But he was thrown off the Condon Committee. But he didn't lose his job. McDonald stood by him. And that's an absolutely true story. And it came out in this cache of documents from the CIA, I got in '94, that Professor Condon and that committee, some of the key people, were on the payroll of the CIA. And it's in black and white. It's an uncontested document. University of Colorado Boulder, prestigious aerospace guy, and he was carrying water and doing the bidding of the intelligence community, all the time masquerading as an objective scientist. So this is why, you know, I have said, like Seth Shostak and those people who are with SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, they are either the stupidest people in the world, or they're on the payroll of somebody to lie to the public. You cannot be that stupid, given the dispositive evidence we put out there. And I actually debated on Voice of America, the head of the SETI project, Seth Shostak and I had my disclosure project witnesses there. We basically cleaned his clock because the evidence is so dispositive and overwhelming if you go through our material archive. But this happens all the time. So if you just extrapolate, that goes a couple of examples throughout the professorial class and scientific class. That's how it's done. Now, in some cases, it's done not for payment so much as to protect your own reputation. For example, there was a guy named Carl Sagan. Everybody know who he is? Cosmos series and all that. He actually was on the payroll of the intelligence community. And what happened is that Carl Sagan, there were some improprieties in his PhD thesis, which led to the intelligence community reaching out to him. And they basically said, you're going to tell the public what we're going to tell you to tell the public, or you're going to be washing the floors at Cornell. You're not going to be a professor. And a good friend of his, two of his friends, George Fennell, who co-founded the Extrasolar Planetary Society and founded the Allegheny Observatory outside Pittsburgh, who's on my team, James Mullaney, who is a very eminent astronomer who was the editor of Sky Telescope magazine and Astronomy magazine, confirmed to me that this happened to Carl Sagan. And one of them told me that he basically aged 30 years in a month because he had to sell his soul to the devil. And so he went from someone looking into UFOs and actually said some positive things about their reality to being a chief debunker of them. And that was a real tragedy because they had what's called opposition research, like a political party had. They had dirt on him. And they used it to turn him. But to the public, you know, he was this renowned, respected scientific figure. So just magnify that all through society. That's how it operates. And I know it's not a very pretty picture. It's a little cynical. It's not cynical. It's just the reality. People need to, it's childhood's end here today. Wake up. This is how the world actually works. It's bare knuckle time. And that's one of the big problems is that the same thing happens in the media. Everyone thinks we have a free press. We don't have a free press. We have a free press about things like the stain on the blue dress or something like that. or other, Kardashian's wardrobe. But on anything really critical like this, we do not have a free press. And I can give you many, many, many examples. I'll only give you a couple. And this involves both the mainstream news media and another one that involves Hollywood. Take this and extrapolate it. Ira Rosen won his Emmy working with Mike Wallace at ABC News. He then became the executive producer, ABC News New York, for Primetime Live in 2020. When we started moving forward with the Disclosure Project, he came out to my farm in Virginia and came out with a production team. I gave him 35 hours of top secret testimony and countless top secret documents. And he says, either this is the biggest hoax in the world or the biggest story in human history. And he says, I think it's the latter. I said, it is. He says, we're going to do a series of town hall meetings with your witnesses, and we're going to do a huge expose on this. I said, I don't think ABC will let you. And he said, I'm the executive producer and I have final decision over this. I said, Ira, I don't think they'll let you, but I'll cooperate here. Here's 20 years of research and all this effort. You can have it on a silver platter. No payment. I'm not a consultant. I give everything away for free. So he goes back to New York. He takes me up there. There's Diane Sawyer and all these guys. Well, what's interesting? And I said, well, if you can make this happen, it's awesome. So a couple weeks later, he calls me up rather sheepishly. And he says, Dr. Greer, they're not going to let me do this story. And I said, well, Ira, I thought you said you had total control over programming for Primetime Live. He says, Dr. Greer, not for this. And I said, well, who are they? He says, Dr. Greer, you know who they are. And that was the end of it. And we've stayed in touch. She's now back with 60 Minutes. But that was one of the reasons why many of you may have remembered that Mike Wallace went on Larry King Live and had a deep depressive breakdown. And he talked about, he kept saying, I was a fraud, I'm a fraud. And part of it is that a guy named Schwartz, who was on the board of Time Life, and I met, and he was very good friends with Mike Wallace, and Mike Wallace had gotten a hold of a cache of these documents. And I was in New York at a party, and Bob Schwartz said to me, he says, look, he said, the media has become the scribe taking dictation from the right hand of the king, and particularly on something like this. And so Mike Wallace, who was this esteemed investigative reporter, couldn't touch the biggest investigative reporting story in history. And he felt like a total fraud and went into a deep depression over it. If you take Hollywood, the same thing happens. The only movies you really see that come out anymore, now Close Encounters of the Third Kind by Spielberg was a docudrama. He was given access to some of the secret files at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's true. If you haven't seen that movie, go see it. It's classic. But in modern times, that was in the 70s, I think, it just isn't possible. The studios are completely mobbed up with people, just like these scientists who actually are on the payroll, with people that respond to the intelligence community. So Arnold Kopelson was a huge producer, had multi-billion-dollar in gross sales for his movies, flew me out to LA. He wanted to do an enormous expose, true life story, be like Argo, but based on my work and what I've done. It'd be a thriller. You have murder, you have mayhem, you have intrigue, you have ET contact, you have the whole thing. He loved it. And he was there, and I was at 20th Century Fox, and he had a $60 million discretionary budget to do any movie he wanted, pre-approved, because he was a big name. And I said, well, Arnold, I don't think they're going to let you do this one. He says, oh, yes, I'm Arnold Kopelson, and I've done this. And he took me to his vanity wall of all his awards. I said, great, wonderful, give me a call. So he sends one of his chief assistants here to D.C. when we're doing the private closed briefings for members of Congress in April of 1997. And she goes back, and he goes below. He said, this is the most incredible bunch of information, because we filmed all that. And so I let him have that closed briefing film. He says, this is going to be the biggest movie. It'll be bigger than E.T. or Close Encounters or any of them, and certainly it'd be bigger than something like Avatar. I said, well, good, do it. So, but I don't know if they'll let you. He says, why do you say that? I said, well, let's see. Let's put it in, start it down the path and let's see what happens. A few weeks later, I get a call from Arnold Kopelson. He says, Dr. Greer, they won't let me do this movie. I said, oh, Arnold, I thought you had this $60 million already in the bank ready to roll. He says, not for this. Fox has killed it. Put it in turnaround faster than 10 light years of light speed. So it went into turnaround and got killed. And turnaround means when you take a film and basically kill it. So that's what happened. And it's happened. I give you this example. If I'd be here until tomorrow morning giving you examples I've had with the media, the mainstream media, where this has happened over and over and over again. So one of the problems is the big media do not allow certain things to be exposed. And we have been brainwashed to think that we're the land of the free and have a free press and a free market, etc. But we do only within a certain confine. But ironically, that confine is a prison. Because how do you have a free market if the most important technologies and information of the last 100 years is sequestered and can't be used? I mean, that's not a free market. That's a managed market and controlled, and it is. Same thing with the media. So that's really how that works, and you need to understand that's a very important component of how magic infiltrates and operates. And keep that in mind whenever you start seeing a major media report. And now with the internet, we can put something out and it can reach, ironically, we can put a video out and it'll have 5 million views, and it'll reach more people than Larry King Live used to, or most of the CNN talk show hosts get. So luckily we're able to bypass it now, but back in the good old days. But even then it's sort of relegated to mainstream. The thing that people respect for their source of news, CBS News, ABC News, CNN, et cetera, and so on, won't touch this in a credible way. And if they start to, and believe me, there have been many initiatives from the Wall Street Journal approached me, wanted to do a huge story, gets killed, gets killed, gets killed. So there are operatives that are embedded in the corporate, the integrated corporations of all of these media holding companies. And it will not make it out. And that has been my experience to date. I'd love to be surprised.
Consider this fictitious example that's inspired by real life. Say you're watching the news and you see a story about a new study on the cholesterol-lowering drug called Cholextra. The study says Cholextra is so effective that doctors should consider prescribing it to adults and even children who don't yet have high cholesterol. Is it too good to be true? You're smart, you decide to do some of your own research. You do a Google search, you consult social media, Facebook and Twitter, you look at Wikipedia, WebMD, a nonprofit website, and you read the original study in a peer-reviewed published medical journal. It all confirms how effective Cholextra is. You do run across a few negative comments and a potential link to cancer, but you dismiss that because medical experts call the cancer link a myth and say that those who think there is a link there are quacks and cranks and nuts. Finally, you learn that your own doctor recently attended a medical seminar. The lecture that he attended confirmed how effective Cholextra is, so he sends you off with some free samples and a prescription. You've really done your homework. But what if all isn't as it seems? What if the reality you found was false? A carefully constructed narrative by unseen special interests designed to manipulate your opinion. A Truman Show-esque alternate reality all around you. Complacency in the news media combined with incredibly powerful propaganda and publicity forces mean we sometimes get little of the truth. Special interests have unlimited time and money to figure out new ways to spin us while cloaking their role. Surreptitious Astroturf methods are now more important to these interests than traditional lobbying of Congress. There's an entire industry built around it in Washington. What is Astroturf? It's a perversion of grassroots, as in fake grassroots. Astroturf is when political, corporate, or other special interests disguise themselves and publish blogs, start Facebook and Twitter accounts, publish ads, letters to the editor, or simply post comments online to try to fool you into thinking an independent or grassroots movement is speaking. The whole point of Astroturf is to try to give the impression there's widespread support for or against an agenda when there's not. Astroturf seeks to manipulate you into changing your opinion by making you feel as if you're an outlier when you're not. One example is the Washington Redskins name. Without taking a position on the controversy, if you simply were looking at news media coverage over the course of the past year or looking at social media, you'd probably have to conclude that most Americans find that name offensive and think it ought to be changed. But what if I told you 71% of Americans say the name should not be changed? That's more than 2/3. Astroturfers seek to controversialize those who disagree with them. They attack news organizations that publish stories they don't like, whistleblowers who tell the truth, politicians who dare to ask the tough questions, and journalists who have the audacity to report on all of it. Sometimes astroturfers simply shove intentionally so much confusing and conflicting information into the mix that you're left to throw up your hands and disregard all of it, including the truth. Drown out a link between a medicine and a harmful side effect, say vaccines and autism, by throwing a bunch of conflicting paid-for studies, surveys, and experts into the mix, confusing the truth beyond recognition. And then there's Wikipedia. Astroturf's dream come true. Billed as the free encyclopedia that anyone can edit, the reality can't be more different. Anonymous Wikipedia editors control and co-opt pages on behalf of special interests. They forbid and reverse edits that go against their agenda. They skew and delete information in blatant violation of Wikipedia's own established policies with impunity, always superior to the poor schlubs who actually believe anyone can edit Wikipedia, only to discover they're barred from correcting even the simplest factual inaccuracies. Try adding a footnoted fact or correcting a fact error on one of these monitored Wikipedia pages and poof, sometimes within a matter of seconds you'll find your edit is reversed. In 2012, famed author Philip Roth tried to correct a major fact error about the inspiration behind one of his book characters cited on a Wikipedia page. But no matter how hard he tried, Wikipedia's editors wouldn't allow it. They kept reverting the edits back to the false information. When Roth finally reached a person at Wikipedia, which was no easy task, and tried to find out what was going wrong, they told him he simply was not considered a credible source on himself. A few weeks later, there was a huge scandal when Wikipedia officials got caught offering a PR service that skewed and edited information on behalf of paid, publicity-seeking clients in utter opposition to Wikipedia's supposed policies. All of this may be why, when a medical study looked at medical conditions described on Wikipedia pages and compared it to actual peer-reviewed published research, Wikipedia contradicted medical research 90% of the time. You may never fully trust what you read on Wikipedia again, nor should you. Let's now go back to that fictitious Colextra example and all the research you did. It turns out the Facebook and Twitter accounts you found that were so positive were actually written by paid professionals hired by the drug company to promote the drug. The Wikipedia page had been monitored by an agenda editor also paid by the drug company. The drug company also arranged to optimize Google search engine results, so it was no accident that you stumbled across that positive nonprofit that had all those positive comments. The nonprofit was, of course, secretly founded and funded by the drug company. The drug company also financed that positive study and used its power of editorial control to omit any mention of cancer as a possible side effect. Once more, each and every doctor who publicly touted Colextra or called the cancer link a myth, or ridiculed critics as paranoid cranks and quacks, or served on a government advisory board that approved the drug, each of those doctors is actually a paid consultant for the drug company. As for your own doctor, the medical lecture he attended that had all those positive evaluations was, in fact, like many continuing medical education classes, sponsored by the drug company. And when the news reported on that positive study, it didn't mention any of that. I have tons of personal examples from real life. A couple of years ago, CBS News asked me to look into a story about a study coming out from the nonprofit National Sleep Foundation. Supposedly, this press release coming out said, the study concluded we're a nation with an epidemic of sleeplessness and we don't even know it, and we should all go ask our doctors about it. A couple of things struck me about that. First, I recognized the phrase, ask your doctor, as a catchphrase promoted by the pharmaceutical industry. They know that if they can get your foot through the door of the doctor's office to mention a malady, you're very likely to be prescribed the latest drug that's marketed. Second, I wondered how serious an epidemic of sleeplessness could really be if we don't even know that we have it. Right? It didn't take long for me to do a little research and discover that the National Sleep Foundation nonprofit and the study, which was actually a survey, not a study, were sponsored in part by a new drug that was about to be launched onto the market called Lunesta, a sleeping pill. I reported the study as CBS News asked, but of course I disclosed the sponsorship behind the nonprofit and the survey so that viewers could weigh the information accordingly. All the other news media reported the same survey directly off the press release as written without digging past the superficial. It later became an example written up in the Columbia Journalism Review, which quite accurately reported that only we at CBS News had bothered to do a little bit of research and disclose the conflict of interest behind this widely reported survey. So now you may be thinking, what can I do? I thought I'd done my research. What chance do I have separating fact from fiction, especially if seasoned journalists with years of experience can be so easily fooled? Well, I have a few strategies that I can tell you about to help you recognize signs of propaganda and Astroturf. Once you start to know what to look for, you'll begin to recognize it everywhere. First, hallmarks of Astroturf include use of inflammatory language such as crank, quack, nutty, lies, paranoid, pseudo, and conspiracy. Astroturfers often claim to debunk myths that aren't myths at all. Use of the charged language tests well. People hear something's a myth, maybe they find it on Snopes, and they instantly declare themselves too smart to fall for it. But what if the whole notion of the myth is itself a myth, and you and Snopes fell for that? Beware when interests attack an issue by controversializing or attacking the people, personalities, and organizations surrounding it rather than addressing the facts. That could be Astroturf. And most of all, Astroturfers tend to reserve all of their public skepticism for those exposing wrongdoing rather than the wrongdoers. In other words, instead of questioning authority, they question those who question authority. You might start to see things a little more clearly. It's kind of like taking off your glasses and wiping them and putting them back on and realizing for the first time how foggy they'd been all along. I can't resolve these issues, but I hope that I've given you some information that will at least motivate you to take off your glasses and wipe them and become a wiser consumer of information in an increasingly artificial, paid-for reality.
The science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. This is a very widespread belief in our society. It's the kind of belief system of people who say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. It's a belief system which has now been spread to the entire world. But there's a conflict in the heart of science between science as a method of inquiry based on reason, evidence, hypothesis, and collective investigation, and science as a belief system or a worldview. And unfortunately, the worldview aspect of science has come to inhibit and constrict the free inquiry, which is the very lifeblood of the scientific endeavor. Since the late 19th century, science has been conducted under the aspect of a belief system or worldview, which is essentially that of materialism, philosophical materialism. And the sciences are now wholly owned subsidiaries of the materialist worldview. I think that as we break out of it, the sciences will be regenerated. What I do in my book, The Science Delusion, which is called Science Set Free in the United States, is take the 10 dogmas or assumptions of science and turn them into questions, seeing how well they stand up if you look at them scientifically. None of them stand up very well. What I'm going to do is first run through what these 10 dogmas are, and then I'll only have time to discuss one or two of them in a bit more detail. But essentially, the 10 dogmas, which are the default worldview of most educated people all over the world, are first that nature is mechanical or machine-like. The universe is like a machine, animals and plants are like machines, We're like machines. In fact, we are machines. We're lumbering robots, in Richard Dawkins' vivid phrase, with brains that are genetically programmed computers. Second, matter is unconscious. The whole universe is made up of unconscious matter. There's no consciousness in stars, in galaxies, in planets, in animals, in plants, and there ought not to be any in us either, if this theory is true. So a lot of the philosophy of mind over the last 100 years is trying to prove that we're not really conscious at all. So the matter's unconscious, then the laws of nature are fixed. This is dogma 3. The laws of nature are the same now as they were at the time of the Big Bang, and they'll be the same forever. Not just the laws, but the constants of nature are fixed, which is why they're called constants. Dogma 4, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. It never changes in total quantity, except at the moment of the Big Bang, when it all sprang into existence from nowhere in a single instant. The fifth dogma is that nature is purposeless. There are no purposes in all nature, and the evolutionary process has no purpose or direction. Dogma 6, biological heredity is material. Everything you inherit is in your genes, or in epigenetic modifications of the genes, or in cytoplasmic inheritance. It's material. Dogma 7, memories are stored inside your brain as material traces. Somehow everything you remember is in your brain in modified nerve endings, phosphorylated proteins. No one knows how it works, but nevertheless, almost everyone in the scientific world believes it must be in the brain. Dogma 8, your mind is inside your head. All your consciousness is the activity of your brain and nothing more. Dogma 9, which follows from dogma 8, psychic phenomena like telepathy are impossible. Your thoughts and intentions cannot have any effect at a distance because your mind's inside your head. Therefore, all the apparent evidence for telepathy and other psychic phenomena is illusory. People believe these things happen, but it's just because they don't know enough about statistics, or they're deceived by coincidences, or it's wishful thinking. And dogma 10, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. That's why governments only fund research into mechanistic medicine and ignore complementary and alternative therapies. Those can't possibly really work because they're not mechanistic. They may appear to work because people would have got better anyway, or because of the placebo effect. But the only kind that really works is mechanistic medicine. Well, this is the default worldview, which is held by almost all educated people all over the world. It's the basis of the educational system, the National Health Service, the Medical Research Council, governments, and it's just the default worldview of educated people. But I think every one of these dogmas is very, very questionable. And when you look at it, they fall apart. I'm going to take first the idea that the laws of nature are fixed. This is a hangover from an older worldview before the 1960s, when the Big Bang theory came in. People thought that the whole universe was eternal, governed by eternal mathematical laws. When the Big Bang came in, then that assumption continued, even though the Big Bang revealed a universe that's radically evolutionary, about 14 billion years old, growing and developing and evolving for 14 billion years, growing and cooling, and more structures and patterns appear within it. But the idea is all the laws of nature were completely fixed at the moment of the Big Bang, like a cosmic Napoleonic code. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. Well, in an evolutionary universe, why shouldn't the laws themselves evolve? After all, human laws do, and the idea of laws of nature is based on a metaphor with human laws. It's a very anthropocentric metaphor. Only humans have laws. In fact, only civilized societies have laws. As C.S. Lewis once said, to say that a stone falls to earth because it's obeying a law makes it a man and even a citizen. It's a metaphor that we've got so used to, we forget it's a metaphor. In an evolving universe, I think a much better idea is the idea of habits. I think the habits of nature evolve. The regularities of nature are essentially habitual. This was an idea put forward at the beginning of the 20th century by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce. And it's an idea which various other philosophers have entertained, and it's one which I myself have developed into a scientific hypothesis, the hypothesis of morphic resonance, which is the basis of these evolving habits. According to this hypothesis, everything in nature has a kind of collective memory. Resonance occurs on the basis of similarity. As a young giraffe embryo grows in its mother's womb, it tunes in to the morphic resonance of previous giraffes. It draws on that collective memory. It grows like a giraffe, and it behaves like a giraffe because it's drawing on this collective memory. It has to have the right genes to make the right proteins, but genes, in my view, are grossly overrated. They only account for the proteins that the organism can make, not the shape or the form or the behavior. Every species has a kind of collective memory. Even crystals do. This theory predicts that if you make a new kind of crystal for the first time, the very first time you make it, it won't have an existing habit. But once it crystallizes, then the next time you make it, there'll be an influence from the first crystals to the second ones all over the world by morphic resonance. It'll crystallize a bit easier. The third time, there'll be an influence from the first and second crystals. There is, in fact, good evidence that new compounds get easier to crystallize all around the world, just as this theory would predict. It also predicts that if you train animals to learn a new trick, for example, rats learn a new trick in London, then all around the world, rats of the same breed should learn the same trick quicker just because the rats have learned it here. And surprisingly, there's already evidence that this actually happens. Anyway, that's my own hypothesis in a nutshell of morphic resonance. Everything depends on evolving habits, not on fixed laws. But I want to spend a few moments on the constants of nature too, because these are, again, assumed to be constant. Things like the gravitational constant, the speed of light, are called the fundamental constants. Are they really constant? Well, when I got interested in this question, I tried to find out. They're given in physics handbooks. Handbooks of physics list the existing fundamental constants, tell you their value. But I wanted to see if they'd changed. So I got the old volumes of physical handbooks. I went to the Patent Office Library here in London, and they're the only place I could find that kept the old volumes. Normally people throw them away when the new values come out. They throw away the old ones. When I did this, I found that the speed of light dropped between 1928 and 1945 by about 20 kilometers per second. It's a huge drop because they're given with errors of only fractions of decimal points of error. And yet, all over the world, it dropped, and they were all getting values very similar to each other with tiny errors. And then in 1945, it went up, 48, it went up again. And then people started getting very similar values again. I was very intrigued by this, and I couldn't make sense of it. So I went to see the head of metrology at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. Metrology is the science in which people measure constants. And I asked him about this. I said, what do you make of this drop in the speed of light between 1928 and 1945? And he said, oh dear, he said, you've uncovered the most embarrassing episode in the history of our science. So I said, well, could the speed of light have actually dropped? And that would have amazing implications if so. He said, no, of course it couldn't have actually dropped. It's a constant. So, well then how do you explain the fact everyone was finding it going much slower during that period? Is it because they were fudging their results to get what they thought other people should be getting, and the whole thing was just produced in the minds of physicists? We don't like to use the word fudge. I said, well, what do you prefer? He said, well, we prefer to call it intellectual phase locking. So So I said, well, if it was going on then, how can we be so sure it's not going on today? And that the present values are produced by intellectual phase locking. And he said, oh, we know that's not the case. I said, how do we know? He said, we've solved the problem. And I said, well, how? He said, well, we fixed the speed of light by definition in 1972. So I said, but it might still change. He said, yes, but we'd never know it because we've defined the meter in terms of the speed of light. So the units had changed with it. So he looked very pleased about that. They'd fixed that problem. But I said, well, then what about big G, the gravitational constant known in the trade as big G? It's written with a capital G, Newton's universal gravitational constant. That's varied by more than 1.3% in recent years. And it seems to vary from place to place and from time to time. And he said, oh, well, those are just errors. And unfortunately, there are quite big errors with big G. So I said, well, what if it's really changing? I mean, perhaps it is really changing. And then I looked at how they do it. What happens is they measure it in different labs. They get different values on different days, and then they average them. And then other labs around the world do the same, and they come out usually with a rather different average. And then the International Committee on Metrology meets every 10 years or so and average the ones from labs around the world to come up with the value of big G. But what if G were actually fluctuating? What if it changed? There's already evidence, actually, that it changes throughout the day and throughout the year. What if the Earth, as it moves through the galactic environment, went through patches of dark matter or other environmental factors that could alter it? Maybe they all change together. What if these errors are going up together and down together? For more than 10 years, I've been trying to persuade metrologists to look at the raw data. In fact, I'm now trying to persuade them to put it online on the internet with the dates and the actual measurements and see if they're correlated, to see if they're all up at one time, all down at another. If so, they might be fluctuating together, and that would tell us something very, very interesting. But no one has done this. They haven't done it because G's are constant. There's no point looking for changes. You see, here's a very simple example of where a dogmatic assumption actually inhibits inquiry. I myself think that the constants may vary quite considerably, within narrow limits, but they may all be varying. And I think the day will come when scientific journals like Nature have a weekly report on the constants, like stock market reports in newspapers. You know, this week, big G was slightly up, the charge on the electron was down, the speed of light held steady, and so on. That's one area, just one area where I think thinking less dogmatically could open things up. One of the biggest areas is the nature of the mind. This is the most unsolved problem, as Graham just said, that science simply can't deal with the fact we're conscious. And it can't deal with the fact that our thoughts don't seem to be inside our brains. Our experiences don't all seem to be inside our brain. Your image of me now doesn't seem to be inside your brain, yet the official view is there's a little Rupert somewhere inside your head, and everything else in this room is inside your head. Your experience is inside your brain. I'm suggesting actually that vision involves an outward projection of images. What you're seeing is in your mind, but not inside your head. Our minds are extended beyond our brains in the simplest act of perception. I think that we project out the images we're seeing, and these images touch what we're looking at. If I look at you from behind, you don't know I'm there. Could I affect you? Could you feel my gaze? There's a great deal of evidence that people can. The sense of being stared at is an extremely common experience, and recent experimental research suggests it's real. Animals seem to have it too. I think it probably evolved in the context of predator-prey relationships. Prey animals that could feel the gaze of a predator would survive better than those that couldn't. This would lead to a whole new way of thinking about ecological relationships between predators and prey, also about the extent of our minds. If we look at distant stars, I think our minds reach out in a sense to touch those stars and literally extend out over astronomical distances. They're not just inside our heads. Now, it may seem astonishing that this is a topic of debate in the 21st century. We know so little about our own minds that where our images are is a hot topic of debate within consciousness studies right now. I don't have time to deal with any more of these dogmas, but every single one of them is questionable. If one questions it, new forms of research, new possibilities open up. And I think as we question these dogmas that have held back science so long, science will undergo a reflowering, a renaissance. I'm a total believer in the importance of science. I've spent my whole life as a research scientist, my whole career. But I think by moving beyond these dogmas, it can be regenerated. Once again, it can become interesting and, I hope, life-affirming. Thank you.
People being in space was something that was not accepted by the astronomical community.
This is the 65th anniversary of the writing of this document by Wilbur Smith, who had a top secret clearance, and he was tasked by the Canadian government to find out what the Americans were doing. And if you look at page 2, if you go down to page 2 of this, you're going to see just a brief summary, which I think is, there's a whole lot of detail in the document. This is on our website now, you can look it up. Many of you may have seen this one already, but the reason I want to present it is the importance of the document. And it says, the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher than the H-bomb. Think about that. The H-bomb wasn't detonated until 1952. It was the ultimate doomsday weapon. This project, dealing with UFOs and interstellar technologies, was more highly classified than the H-bomb. Period. B, flying saucers exist. Period. Their modus operandi is unknown, but a concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who also worked with Edward Teller, Oppenheimer, and others. And 4, the entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. I have a whole dossier that a Canadian put together of the Wilbur Smith investigations on behalf of the Canadian government to find out what in the hell the Americans were doing with these extraterrestrial vehicles. It's a fascinating case. Now, the reason this is so important is that it acknowledges several things: that they exist, that it's the most secret issue in the US government, exceeding the secrecy of the H-bomb, and that a group had been put together to study how they operate. Well, they were studying material recovered from one or more interstellar crashes that were the result of using these scalar longitudinal electromagnetic systems, which Tesla had worked on and others had worked on in the early part of the 20th century. Keep in mind that by the early 1900s, there had been experiments done on not only scalar and electromagnetics, that longitudinal systems, which are, just to put it in a simple layman's term, the light in this room that we're looking at, it has a wave function and a particle function. It goes 186,000 miles a second. A scalar longitudinal system is, there's no wave. It's boom, and it's a point, and it's multiples of the speed of light. And so once you understand how these operate, and I have folks at the Naval Research Labs here in Washington who have done communication systems developed based on pulsed scalar systems that are multiple of the speed of light. So if you think that you cannot communicate faster than the speed of light, you are wrong. And the physicists are wrong. It's because they don't know about the scalar end of this, but that's a no, because that's all classified. They're not going to teach you that at MIT or Caltech. So these systems have been developed and have been deployed since at least the mid-1940s, which is a frightening thought because it's an area of technology that is potentially devastating if it's in the wrong hands. And unfortunately, it fell into the wrong hands, and there it remains. So one of the things that happened along the lines around this time, the next document, a very important one. Look at the release date. It was a little while after, a few months after I briefed the CIA director. So after I met with him, I said, look, I'm going to give you a list of stuff I want to see if I can get. I got this massive box. Came out to my farm in Virginia. And this is one of them, and there are others. And it's from 1953, although you can't see the date on it very well here. And it's about it's written by the director of the CIA to the director of Psychological Strategy Board. Psychological Strategy Board. What? Psychological warfare. And it says, you can read it, I'm transmitting to the National Security Council a proposal, tab B-A, which we don't have, which is concluded that the problems connected to UFOs appear to have implications for psychological warfare as well as for intelligence and operations. And then there's another tab, B, which has the background. I'd love to see that one. I suggest that we discuss in an early board meeting the possible offensive or defensive utilization of these phenomena for psychological warfare purposes. Remember this document 4 hours from now, because basically what they concluded was they needed to do a few things. They wanted to be able to set up a deception around the subject and put out false information, use it as a cover story for classified aerospace research. So oftentimes there will be something that happens and it will look like a UFO, and it's actually a Northrop Grumman. My uncle's company was Northrop Grumman. He worked on the thing that landed on the moon, the lunar module. Or Lockheed Martin Skunk Works or some other aerospace entity, and it will be 100% man-made, and the public will say, oh my God, it's a UFO. And they'll not correct them. There's no correction forthcoming. They want you to believe it's a UFO. Why? Because it provides a cover for classified research with technologies that, if they were allowed to come out, would terminate the oil and gas and coal industry. They're using zero-point energy and gravity control. Which then brings me to the next issue, and that is by 1954, October, so now we're 61 years plus 1 month, into an era, and this was confirmed to me by the third highest ranking official at the Naval Research Labs and the highest ranking scientist, in other words, someone who wasn't a bureaucrat, at the Naval Research Labs, which Thomas Edison founded, and the Naval Research Labs is the largest defense lab in the United States. And Richard Foch, and I knew him for many years before he passed away of prostate cancer not too long ago, was this gentleman. I've never wanted to discuss who he was until he passed away. And he was a very senior guy in this system. And one of the things that he shared is that he was in the vault, the same vault that the next document came out of, which has a great story behind it. And he was going through some documentation and found that it wasn't in the 50s that we really started, I mean the 60s or 70s, but it was in the 50s that we actually mastered gravity control. Now what does that mean? Gravity control is the ability to put an electromagnetic field at certain voltages and with certain angular momentum. I don't want to get into a lot of, put you to sleep, I got into the physics of it too far. So that this object becomes massless, weightless, no mass, M-A-S-S. So the mass component, and this has to do with angular momentum and things of this sort, of the subatomic particles, can make this object so light that it has no mass, which means if you look at your physics equations, mass, velocity is inversely proportional to mass. Go look it up. So if mass becomes 0, velocity can go to infinity in a given amount of energy, which means you can move into another dimension. It doesn't go to infinity, you go trans-dimensional. We'll talk about this some more later. And this began to be experimented with in the 1920s. A guy named T. Townsend Brown developed a system using crystalline structures and very high voltages going into an object so that an object would begin to levitate. Marcel Vogel, one of the chief engineer scientists for IBM in North Carolina on the Reynolds estate, did the same thing in the 60s and 70s. One of the members of my team and one of our disclosure project witnesses worked with Marcel Vogel, doing this with crystalline structures. And it can be crystals, but it can also be nanocrystalline materials such as metallic. So, as you know, most metals and rocks are crystal. Actually, water is crystalline. We're crystalline. So you can put this system around almost anything, and it will begin to become increasingly massless. Now, it doesn't have to be 0 mass. Maybe it's 0.1 mass. So it's still materialized, and you see it, but it means, man, can you accelerate this thing? So it means you can, instead of going like the space shuttle at 25,000 miles an hour, you can go at several million miles per hour and take a right turn. And there's no deceleration effect because everyone on board is corrected for 1G. We were starting with decades of research in classified electronics, electromagnetic fields, anti-gravity, scalar systems, et cetera, and so on, that had been going on since the time of Nikola Tesla, the true genius of the 20th century, not Albert Einstein, by the way, so who is a minor luminary compared to Tesla. And, sorry, Einstein fans, it's true. By the way, that's why when Nikola Tesla died, the FBI swooped into his apartment and confiscated all of his secret papers. And how do I know this? I have a document from the Department of Defense demanding that the FBI turn them over and names them for what they are, the secret papers of Nikola Tesla. This is not an urban myth. I have that document. It came in this cache of documents I'm talking about. So when you have all of that knowledge, it's then augmented, increased, potentiated by the study of, as the Wilbur-Smith document says, the material that was interstellar. Because you need specialized materials. You need control systems. You need integrated circuits, which we did not have in the 40s. Which came from this. You need fiber optics. You need all kinds of stuff. So some of the technologies, and this is where Colonel Corso, who worked on these projects tangentially, is correct. If you read The Day After Roswell, he says fiber optics, integrated circuits, and a whole slew of things came from studying the materiel from these crashed ET interstellar objects. So you had the biggest and most top secret, most well-funded project in the history of the United States going on. Nobody knew about it. It's completely sub rosa. It was more secret than the hydrogen bomb. And so between 1945 and 1954, The brain power of those Nazi aerospace folks like Werner von Braun and Hermann Oberth, the work of T. Townsend Brown and others, Edward Teller, some of the brightest and most ingenious people in the world, bent their attention primarily not to the hydrogen bomb, but to gravity control and how are these interstellar visitors getting here? Because that would then be the ultimate edge, wouldn't it, in the technological arms race. You talk about a delivery system. You don't need an intercontinental ballistic missile that goes a few thousand miles an hour if you can deliver something instantly from one continent to another, or worse, from one planet to another. You begin to see the implications of this for national security. Therefore, it was managed in an extraordinary fashion. And the secrecy around it was increasingly ruthless. So much so that by 1956, the President of the United States, a man named Dwight Eisenhower, most of us drive on Eisenhower-era highways using 1880s Mercedes-type internal combustion engine cars that are run by fossil fuels, all of which have been obsolete since the 1940s or sooner. But Eisenhower was a five-star general, became president, two-term president, and was a Republican, very patriotic, but also very naively trusting. Jackie Gleason, the very famous comedian, his wife were friends with some folks that had been on my team before they passed away, and said that Eisenhower on his deathbed was a very bitter man over what happened to him between 1954 and when he left office in early 1961 when Jack Kennedy became the President of the United States. And in 1956, a man named Nelson Rockefeller, who later, of course, became vice president, and prior to that was an operative in the military-industrial complex and the emerging deep national security state, Nelson headed up what's called the Rockefeller Commission. And the Rockefeller Commission in 1956 reorganized the Pentagon, Department of Defense, CIA, the whole alphabet soup of secret entities. And they did so in such a way that it became labyrinthine, Byzantine, almost impossible to penetrate by anyone who wanted to navigate through it. One of the things I wanted to make really clear about what I'm presenting today, I'm not talking about anything that I don't have firsthand direct knowledge of. Everything I'm telling you, every bit of it. But I don't care about conspiracy theories. They're mostly 99% wrong. And I really don't care about the internet chatter. You know, this is 25 years of the most incredible investigative research. And, you know, I put over $10 million of my earnings in life into to get this far. And I can tell you, if you're in an unacknowledged project, and I was offered this position back in '92, and asked my wife about it. And I rejected it. I was actually offered $2 billion personally, if a fund with $2 billion in it, if I would shut the hell up, join one of these unacknowledged projects and do what they wanted me to do. And I said, screw you. I'm not doing it.
And the important part is that this introduces a concept which I'd like to share with the panel, and that is inertia is involved. And as we get to the next slide, hopefully we can see that, the inertial mass and gravitational mass are totally different. I repeat myself, inertial mass and gravitational mass have nothing to do with each other. Einstein made a mistake years ago and called it the equivalence principle. I studied it even in grad school. I took relativity and I took general relativity. And so it's fascinating to me that it's sort of overlooked. Slide right after this. And the important part is that nowadays, inertia has been discovered to be a zero-point field Lorentz force by Czysz, Loder, and Puthoff. This is a seminal paper that's so important that it opens the door to actually controlling inertia and understanding how any ET craft or UFOs could possibly have fast acceleration, right-angle turns, and maybe even travel through the universe. It turns out F equals V cross B, a simple Lorentz force at the bottom of the slide there showing how it works. So when we go around a curve and you feel that force moving you in the opposite direction, it's an electromagnetic interaction. Next slide. And this applies to relativity. I heard one of the gentlemen on the panels questioning special relativity. Well, that's inertial mass. That is the m in relativistic increase in mass as you go toward the speed of light. If you can shield inertial mass, miracles happen. And this is another demonstration. I showed this slide to the deputy director of the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, in case you don't know what NRO stands for. And this was very important because, as you see, F equals ma, Newton's law can be modified. If m can be shielded and it lowers, then a could increase for the same amount of force. Next slide. Oh, and by the way, the NRO deputy director said, well, things like this tend to become more and more classified until they're out of sight. He says it's easier for us to reinvent it for a private contractor. And I said, you mean the taxpayers have to pay double for something like this? And he said, yes. So here's another proof of inertial shielding, and that is the right-angle turn that's photographed here with open shutter, 35 millimeter on tripod, 2 a.m. outside Stewart Air Force Base. The triangle craft started from the upper part, and the shutter was open, made a tremendous right turn, then continued as if nothing happened. Red and green lights make it look like it's conventional. Next slide.
And Dr. Vallone, you've got about 1 minute.
I understand. I see. And now the conclusion is electrokinetic equation helps explain how we can combine electrokinetics or electrogravitics and inertial shielding. Pulsed current will produce a force. Next slide. And I wrote a book on the electrogravitics effect that's even present in the B-2 bomber, thanks to Paula Violette's work and research, and originally starting with Townsend Brown's research. Next slide. And the conclusion is, and I have to give thanks to Mark McCandlish, who gave a testimony at Dr. Greer's 2001 disclosure project in DC, since we know once in a while such electrokinetic powered craft are put on display, as this one was in 1988 in Norton Air Force Base, which is also, his entire testimony is reproduced, thanks to Mark, in my book, Electrovitics 2. And this was also verified and investigated by Dr. Hal Puthoff. And I talked to him personally about this story of Norton Air Force Base showing 3 hovercraft, and he did his due diligence with it, and he says he put it in his gray box of possible events. Thank you.
My question to each of you to answer in the time we have is, where do you believe that the United States ranks in preparation to meet the global needs for the future? And where will the brilliant students that will become adults like yourselves, only some of them have to be women, come from to meet the numbers we're going to need?
Well, when you asked the question, my immediate reaction was, when you said the United States,
Yeah.
I asked myself, who's really in charge of the answer to your question?
Good question.
And so I think the issue which we're dealing with is a truth embargo issue, and this enormous secrecy which controls and dominates our entire process, maybe even including the educational process. But if you talk about the ordinary world that most of us think that we live in, clearly we need to establish the ideas, that new ideas, as the discoveries, as Stan Friedman said, come from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. So I think we need to emphasize the importance of creativity in developing the next set of equations that we need, and may have already been discovered, but we need to make our society better and stronger.
Thank you.
Well, I think we already have everything we need to create a sustainable, poverty-free world. It's already extant, and this is very good news. The very bad news is that there is a ruthless, deep national security state that the people I have worked with, have run into, that is this massive buzzsaw. And I think that at a certain point, we the people and the Congress and the United Nations and other countries have to come together and say, we've had enough of this nonsense. And I do not think this is going to come from an executive order from the president. I think it's going to come from people stepping forward. And I wish to emphasize that, as I did the other day, that in 1998 we declared these unacknowledged special access projects unconstitutional, a priori illegal. And we encouraged, and we now have over 500 people who have come forward to give us information, documents, and what have you on this. And I think we need to continue to do that. I think we have to say to people who are really not responsive to the people that this is still a world of liberty, and we have to be free to know the truth.
Thank you. Very good. Dr. Vallone.
Could I show slide 23, please, as I'm talking? What I'd like to explain is that I agree with our co-panelists, and that is the United States already has this technology, and I had the privilege of talking with a former Black Project engineer. Spent the whole afternoon with him taking pages and pages of notes, one of which is actually in front of me right here. And what I learned is, first of all, he taught me all the details of creating an electrogravitic layered semiconductor that with bismuth in between and magnesium and zinc with the same percentages that when slide 23 pops up, you'll see that was published years before in a colleague's book called Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion. And Dr. Paul LaViolette only let me know a year later, he said, oh, this sounds like what I learned from another Black Project engineer who actually was through Aviation Weekly over in England. So this is very interesting because my contact told me so many things I couldn't believe. I just took the notes down. But after I corroborated this with Linda Moulton Hull's artifact as well, we have 3 different corroborations within 1% variation of the same artifact. In fact, slide 24, if she gets that up, will also show the actual semiconductor. But the important part is that we have the technology. Students are contacting our Integrity Research Institute all the time saying, what should we study? And this is, I used to be a college teacher. You need the 13 chapters with questions and answers at the end of each chapter. And the books need to be written. The zero-point energy book, the electrogravitics book, the textbooks are the textbooks of the future, and the students are already there waiting to study this stuff.
What I consider one of the best gravitational experiments ever done was at the High Temperature Materials Laboratory in Russia. Now, they had done their experiment off-site, and they demonstrated that that thing could develop 35% reduction in the gravitational field. Now, we saw that, we were very impressed with it. I have gravitational researchers at DOE, and I had them look at it. We were all interested in doing that. We'd like to follow up on that to do a second type of experiment. It's duplication, reproducibility, getting back to the issues of how do you do good science. But you run into a lot of resistance against people.
My interest in electrogravitics, which is Towson Brown's work, began in 1985. I was interested because the physics theory I had been working on predicted a coupling between electricity and gravitation, which is pretty much what Brown was illustrating experimentally. In particular, let's say in the standard physics theory with like general relativity, which is our current theory of gravitation, you have only one polarity to gravity, so masses can only attract, and there's no possibility for gravitational repulsion or anti-gravity. Anything that physicists comes up with that is sort of speculating outside of that framework. Physicists have proposed that there might be some coupling between electricity and gravitation at very high energies, and that's one of their reasons for building these huge particle colliders, is they're hoping to find this connection. If they just look before their eyes, the experimental evidence, there is a connection, but it's just normal laboratory voltages that you can generate.
Sakharov and the number of people that were working on it, I think, are very, very convincing arguments that the fabric of space is like an ocean, an energy ocean in which solid energy is floating on it, and solid energy is the mass. And if that's true, then gravity waves exist, And in fact, everything goes back to Heaviside equations, and it's waves, not particles. And the quantum is now not mass, but time. And if that's true, then there's a whole different, you look at the whole universe in a different light. And then a lot of things become possible that we think impossible within our current understanding of what time and space and thrust and force and all that is.
I was appointed by the governor of the state to attend a congressional briefing, a closed congressional briefing on this topic with people like Edgar Mitchell speaking about the reality of this and what have you. And they say, oh, really? Tell me more. So that's one reaction of my scientific colleagues on a one-to-one basis. Part of this gentleman's problems was he was a civilian but had done a lot of work with NASA on a lot of committees and what have you. And I think his problem was the fact that he hadn't heard about this as being a real subject. And he knew that he was very important because he was on a lot of committees in NASA. And since he was very important but hadn't heard about this thing, this couldn't be true, because since he was important, he would have heard about it. You see the logic there? And he sort of said, oh, okay, and so he went on and on and on. But as the conversation went on and I told him more about what I knew and the reality of these things, he got colder and colder toward our discussion. And it started off very warm because we both knew a lot of mutual people, and so there was sort of a coming together in that sense. And I realized afterwards that he was very threatened by this knowledge, because what the particular job that he was doing in NASA would be majorly impacted by the knowledge that there are extraterrestrials already here on this planet, visiting our planet, and that they have the ability to travel through space and what have you. And so my sense was that his raison d'etre, the reason that he works at NASA and his ego is sort of wrapped up in this, would no longer be as valid a reason if what I was saying was true. And so he pulled back from me. And then he said a very curious thing. I wouldn't believe it even if it was real. This is a direct quote from his email to me. I would not believe this even if it was real. And then he went on, but if you learn anything more about this, let me know. So so I was left with this, forget it. I'm not gonna, if your mind is so closed that you make a statement, I wouldn't believe it even if it was real. It tells me we have a major problem with scientists in our universities in getting them to accept something different than their paradigms that they're so used to or been grown up with. That's a major problem.
There appears to be a process where the American Physical Society spokesman, Robert Park, makes fun of the new technology on his website, making sort of sarcastic comments about it, or pointing out how it breaks certain laws of physics that are their codes of what they believe is valid, and in effect creating the impression that this is a fraudulent idea, that somebody's doing something illegal to be trying to sell this idea or patent it. In the case of black light, they had a long vendetta against the inventor of this process, who was able to get energy out of just plain water, that a glass of water would produce more energy than if you had that glass filled with gasoline, which is what Mills is finding. He's finding ultraviolet light is given off during this transition, and this is how he generates the energy. And he has a catalyst that's able to release this energy. Well, he has made some patents on this, and just as the one patent on this was about to issue, it had been actually announced in the Patent Gazette and was formally going to issue in a week or two, Robert Park starts making fun of it on his website, and apparently there must have been a email campaign or contacting the patent office. It embarrassed the patent office, and they pulled the patent, which is really illegal what they did, to withdraw a patent after it had been already approved to be issued. because according to patent law, you're only an invention is allowed to be patented if it works and if it's something new. It can work and break the laws of physics as physicists know it, and it still has the right to be patented. Time and again, technology has driven physics theory. Physics theory tends to be restraining on technological advancement because all you would come up with is the ideas that your theory happened to predict. Now, if that was the case, our technological advance would slow to a halt. So the system, fortunately, our patent system is set up to allow us to go beyond the laws of physics to patent things that work. Now, what the Patent Office in its current approach is, it's actually breaking the law. It's trying to make happy the physicists who are with American Physical Society to keep them in power with their ideas, you might say, and withhold from public use good inventions that could solve our problems, like the energy crisis. And, Blacklight Power, the company that has this invention, is not taking this lightly, and they have initiated a court suit. And I think very strong possibility they're going to win this case. But you see, this is not an isolated case. There's a whole pattern of this going on at the Patent Office. I personally know, because I was at the Patent Office for about a year, and I know some people there, and I know some of the things that were going on. And for example, there was somebody I know who issued a patent on a process of sending signals faster than the speed of light. This was then made fun of by Robert Park on his website. Through their connections, they had this posted somewhere as the most ridiculous patent of the year award, this sort of thing. In effect, they embarrassed the Patent Office, and shortly after this happened, this embarrassing publicity occurred, the commissioner of the Patent Office reprimanded the examiner and his supervisor, and he threatened to fire the supervisor. So in effect, trying to satisfy this lobby group, that's all you can call it, it's a lobby group, it's outside the government, that has undue influence on the Patent Office and shouldn't really be allowed to. I mean, they can say what they want, it's freedom of speech, but for the Patent Office to do their bidding instead of following a law, that is illegal. You could argue just on the basis of viewing physics as a religion, in a way, a belief system, that anything that challenges their belief system, they're going to oppose. And they don't care if it's something that's going to help society, because it would make them look like fools that, geez, they can't explain this, and maybe their theories are wrong. People are going to start wondering, why do we send our children to colleges? Why are these university professors getting funded to build huge accelerators, which, for what purpose? You know, why do we spend billions of dollars on the super collider in Texas? And so there obviously must be a monetary connection here, where they're trying to protect their butts for funding too. These new technologies, new energy technologies, for example, are the underdog, you have to admit it. They don't fit into the paradigm that is currently taught and believed, and so they are left out of getting the funding to be developed or to get their patents, even to the point that they're breaking the law to prevent them from their patents from being issued. Without their patents being issued, how are investors going to invest in the company?
Some of the breakthroughs in the past have been deliberately suppressed. I will name a few. T. Henry Moray was inspired, of course, by Tesla's work, and he demonstrated so many times to so many scientific and engineering groups and people who were skilled in the art. There is absolutely no question that T. Henry Moray had a system that produced about 50 kilowatts out of a 55-pound box. This is well established as you go back and look at all kind of certified tests and everything else that he did. There's all kinds of skullduggery that happened there. I don't think T. Henry Moray ever got a decent chance to ever do anything with that. The Russians even tried to kidnap him at one time. It reads like a James Bond movie, but it's real. It really happened, and it really happened here in the United States.
What year was that?
This was before the war. This was in the 1930s. In the same general period of time, one of the greatest electromagnetic fellows we ever had, scientist, was Gabriel Krohn. And Gabriel Krohn invented a true negative resistor working on a Navy contract for Stanford University. He was never permitted to reveal the exact way that he constructed his negative resistor. But I used direct quotes where he in fact said we have a negative resistor and we can disconnect the generator from this network analyzer when we got negative resistors in there because they will power the circuit. So that one was in fact suppressed. I don't know whatever happened to it, but it vanished. And he never did reveal the secret of what he called his open path, connecting any 2 points in a circuit. But it is in the literature and it's well documented because he was perhaps the leading electrical scientist in the United States at that time. Well, there's another one that went down the tube. Various and sundry people have made casual ones from time to time over the years. I'd estimate probably 50 different inventors have casually invented something. Even if they didn't understand it, they did get it to go over unity. We're never able to get anything done with it. Most of the time they incurred a lot of enmity from the scientific community. Sometimes we're really hounded. And sometimes we're just very naive. Sometimes very naive. Probably the best documented scientifically over unity systems, self-running, self-powering systems, were developed by the Russians before World War II. It's in the French scientific literature, and it's also in the Russian scientific literature. The papers are there. I quote them in many of the things that I published. And you can go check the papers. The theory is there. Many papers are published on this in the Russian scientific literature. They built what we call parametric oscillators. They have an oscillator going and they change in the middle, they switch the actual inductance or capacitance or both of the things so that it becomes a self-oscillation device. And they reached, goodly power for those days of 50 and 100 kilowatt devices. There are many ways of looking at the suppression that's occurred in this area, and certainly I do not wish to talk about it myself, but I've been a victim of quite a bit of suppression. So has any other legitimate researcher in this area. All I can do is give you my ideas and drawn from my own experiences and what I think it is and where I think it's coming from. Today, we don't have so much big kingdoms. Today, we have big economic programs, big economic countries, or basically, we have cartels. We have a whole set of cartels in an area, interlocking corporations, and behind this, we have a few people who are quite wealthy and who own most things. Now, the normal nature of the beast for very powerful empires, let's call that an empire. It's a corporate empire, a set of corporations empire, is basically a cartel. Historically, as far back as you want to go, we have had cartels. Any time we have a very powerful cartel or set of people that control a lot of things, that resists any means of changing its inflow of control and its inflow of funds and money and its power. Everybody's trying to be the big monkey. It's really as simple as that. And so the more powerful the agency, the more powerful the group, the more powerful the cartel, the more they will resort not only to legal means but to extra legal means to suppress their competition. This is openly known today. For example, the greatest espionage in the world is industrial espionage between one corporation and another right here in America. They're the ones that hire all the spies and the spooky equipment and everything like that, by far more than the intel agents do. So that's one thing we have. We have the giant industrial or really economic cartels in energy. And it's not one cartel. There are many, many groups in energy, and each of those has become very powerful in its own area, and each one does not wish to see simple little electrical taps pulling out enormous energy from the vacuum. They would much rather see you burning a lot more oil and so forth. So yes, in my view, there is a very active suppression effort by those kinds of folks. So the problem we ran into was that the electrodynamics had actually been modified to throw out the very kind of systems that we had seen in our experiments, evidence that could be done, but violates the ordinary electrodynamics. And we can do it and not violate conservation of energy. We can do it in accord with thermodynamics, and we can do it in accord with physics and electromagnetics. Now this is absolutely rigorous. I don't care how many folks want to check that, it will hold up. It is rigorous. So this was one thing we established from the study of the foundations of electromagnetics. Our engineers are taught to throw away about 10 trillion times for a typical average case as much energy as they pull out of the vacuum without even knowing it in a generator and a battery. And it's pouring out down the circuit and misses the circuit. They throw all that away and only calculate the little bit that we catch in that circuit and then use. Now, when we measure the circuit, we obviously measure the energy being dissipated by the various pieces of that circuit. Well, if the energy is being thrown out of there, it had to get in there. So obviously the measurements of the circuit will match Poynting's theory because it'll match the energy that actually went in there to get dissipated. Like the country boy said, you got a pipe here, so to speak, and it's got some holes in it. If you measure all the water flowing out, that's how much water come in it. Now your whole river can be around it and missing the pipe, and you won't measure that. So we have built a whole science based on throwing away this enormous energy that is pulled out of the vacuum by every little old separation of charges, every dipole. Well, in the 50s, in the 1950s, particle physicists discovered, Wu and others discovered broken symmetry. They discovered how fundamental a process something like this dipole is, where we separate two opposite kinds of charges. And T.D. Lee, for example, looked at it for physical charges and so forth, and Lee won a Nobel Prize for it. Any dipole is a broken symmetry in the Furious exchange with a vacuum. It's a broken three-dimensional symmetry. What does this mean? Cutting through all the words and getting down to country boy language. It means that nature does not insist on conserving energy in 3 dimensions. We do because we have a 3-dimensional mind. We like to think in terms of space because observation itself destroys time and what we look at is spatial. So we like to think the world is made of space, not space-time. However, nature loves to work in 4 dimensions. Her fundamental law is conservation of energy must apply in 4 dimensions. Now you're not going to beat that one, so never think about that. But there is no law of nature that requires you to come in and say, also it must apply simultaneously in 3 dimensions. If we build some gadget that makes it apply in 3 dimensions, we apply an extra constraint on what nature will give us. Turning that around, we go around building things that insist on having this 3-dimensional exchange of energy. We got to put it in 3 dimensions for whatever we get out and lose some in the middle, so we got a terrible situation all the way. It's called entropic engineering. We always got entropy beating us to death. Never go over unity, forget it, lose a lot. We talk about, efficiencies at 30% and so forth for our power systems when we talk about burning the coal and all that stuff. But nature doesn't require you to do that. All you have to do is break a little bit of this 3-symmetry set of chains where you have tied her feet to the floor. Once you break the flow in 3 dimensions, you no longer have to conserve energy in 3 dimensions. The basic conservation of energy is an inflow from 4 dimensions, outflow in 3 dimensions. From the 4th dimension converted and flowed out into 3. And that one is free. Giant negentropy is free. Nature will start reorganizing a goodly percentage of the whole vacuum for you, spreading at the speed of light, and will continue it as long as you leave the dipole alone. The original charges and dipoles in the original matter of the universe have been putting out energy and reorganizing the vacuum for 15 billion years. Today we're said we can't engineer negentropy when negentropy is the easiest thing in the world to engineer, whereas entropy is the hard way to do it, and that's the way we all do it. The bottom line of this is if we'll initiate the negative entropy and let it go, it's just like you punched a hole in the ground and you got a big gusher of oil. You don't have to furnish the pressure and you don't have to furnish the oil. Here it comes. And it comes out in real oil that you can use. And the common dipole in every electrical circuit pours out energy in that fashion. The problem is not how to get enormous energy from the vacuum. That problem been totally solved. It was actually solved in 1903 had we understood it. Had we understood what Whittaker wrote. We didn't. But now we do understand it, and we do certify very rigorously with some of the AIS papers that that is for real. The problem now is how do we catch a goodly bit of this energy and use it asymmetrically. You dump it in a load, let it power that load, and not use half of it to go back over and kill the little dipole. So yes, there are some rather bizarre things that have occurred to some people. As I say, I prefer not to dwell on that, try to get by as much of that as we can and try to dwell on the science. The only way we're ever going to beat all of this stuff, we have to convince the scientific community that there's real science here. Let me now review some of the implications of what I hope is just now emerging in these energy systems, where we take the energy from the vacuum, turn it into normal electromagnetic energy, and we catch it and use it to power our loads. First of all, every system we got out there has been doing this. We just didn't know it. We thought the generator powered the external circuit. It doesn't. It does not power it at all. All it does is we twist the crank on the generator, the shaft, to turn the shaft, and that forms a magnetic field inside the generator, and that energy in that magnetic field dissipates itself upon the internal charges to force the positive charges in one direction and negative charges in the other and make that dipole, and that's all the generator does. It doesn't add 1 watt to the power line. All the coal, all the oil, all the dams ever built, all the nuclear fuel rods ever consumed, never added 1 single watt to the power line. All they did was keep rebuilding the dipole that we have designed the silly circuit to destroy faster than we can power the loads. Not the way to run the railroad. So we have polluted the planet, we're killing species, we're poisoning our own lungs and our own environment. We don't have to do that. But it's a giant set of cartels, it's a giant financial set of empires, and it's going to continue this way unless we get the attention of the scientific community focused on it, and hopefully get some legislative action focused to force the action to develop these kinds of systems. What needs doing immediately deals with the scientific community. If you look at what the scientific community is doing, I'm speaking sadly, but I'm speaking bluntly and truthfully. If you will read the literature, you will find it's almost business as usual. They're not doing anything that has any chance of stopping this problem before the world explodes in our faces. Sure, windmills are good. Burning the oil cleaner is good. All of these things, building a couple of more dams is good if you don't destroy too much of the biosphere, etc., etc. Building some windmills is good. However, that's a spit in the ocean. It doesn't solve the problem. The problem is just exactly like what we had in World War II. We have a problem, it's doable, it can be solved very quickly because we've got the first half of it already solved, how to get the energy out of the vacuum. So half of it is already done. But we can't get the scientific community to move on it, to turn those young grad students loose and those young postdocs loose. The professor at the university, for goodness sakes, is trapped. He's absolutely trapped. All the universities are greedy. They want the overhead money. He's got to bring in extra money. He's got to get patents. And of course, he's got to get his papers published. So he's caught in a process where he must compete for the packages which are put together and come down for availability to compete for. If he doesn't get those packages and win them, he doesn't fund his grad students, he doesn't get the overhead money, he's going to be lucky if he's working for the grocery store instead of being a physicist. So he's in a mad scramble to try to feel and keep running on a treadmill to meet the conditions that's been laid down on him. And goodness sakes, those packages already prescribe all the research he's going to do and his grad students are going to do. So we've got the whole scientific community working on the wrong problem.
So what could the U.S. government do about that?
What we can do is do just like we did in alternative medicine, or really like the Manhattan Project. You can order the scientific community to do it whether they wish to do it or not, and hold them accountable from the highest level to the bottom. How much money are we spending in our national laboratories on nuclear stuff? Don't we think at least about 10% of that money ought to be rooted out of there and spent on nothing but this, which might save us while the other stuff takes us down the tube? Of course we should. In fact, it ought to be more than that. The best scientists we have, the best grad students, the best postdocs ought to be turned loose on this problem, and that means funded. And that means that we do not allow scientists to slander and libel people who are trying to do research in this area. Right now, they do it wholesale, and they do it at will. Now, look at what they call me in print, for goodness sake. But the problem is the scientific community resists change, and it's doing business as usual. And my bottom line is, unless the legislative branch, together with the administration, forces them to get on this problem and solve it, they will not only fiddle while Rome burns, they will help burn it. The only alternative you have now, of course, since at this moment, as we speak, the government has not moved. The scientific community has not moved. So that is a fact as of this moment I'm speaking. I hope that changes. I'm trying to change it. But right now, that is a fact. And right now it's a fact they're not going to move unless something happens to move them, and neither is the scientific community. Failing that, the only thing left is the private industry. And that's a mixed bag. First of all, the moment you try to do it in the private industry, then is when you are absolutely vulnerable to all the games. For example, lawsuit alone can hang you to where you will never come out of it for the next 15 years. The lawsuit doesn't have to be justified or anything at all. You can sue anybody for anything if you've got enough money to file the suit and want to swear. Simple as that. So the other thing you have is you can trigger anybody from anywhere for all kinds of radicals to come out of there and say, oh, you used a coil of wire, or you used something over here, you used some semiconductor, you stole my invention. And so the next thing, you can be in court for 20 years on that. All of this comes at you. This is part of the delay. This is the groups wanting to stay in power while we all go down the tubes. They operate primarily in the private sector. So you're automatically in that arena where the real lions are after you all the time. You're over there trying to find a legitimate deal. Okay, let's talk about venture capital, sometimes called vulture capital, but if you find a good one, it's not vulture, it's venture. What does a venture capitalist want to do? He wants to buy 30% or 50% of your company, or 51, or maybe 60. He's got the money. Then the next thing he wants to do is he's going to move you and all your guys right out of there, and he's going to put his own management team in there, and he's going to run it with bean counters. If you run this one with bean counters only, you destroy the program before you start. So your only choice then is to avoid venture capitalists like the plague and to try to go for licensing, which means the brunt of doing the research on the front end falls on you and your meager resources, which for working people is whatever you can afford out of your back pocket. But if you don't do that, you're not going to do it anyway. How many have you seen in the past that went the venture capital route that were real? How many of them made it? I can name 3 or 4 that were real. They're not there yet. They're not going to be there. They were buried. So the thing that sets in, you have to do it by licensing. Then you got to get the patent office. The patent office says it's impossible to do an over-unity system. The API, the Physics Institute, comes down on you and says it's absolutely against the laws of nature. It isn't. These are people who haven't even studied the problem, and they know classical thermodynamics, but it's against the laws of nature and it violates classical thermodynamics. Of course it violates classical thermo. You can't build one of these by classical thermo. You build it by the other kind of thermodynamics. So the next thing you have is the scientific community is all over. Look what they did to cold fusion. There's real stuff in cold fusion. 600 experiments worked, for goodness sake. So the thing is, you're against the scientific community is against you. Lock, stock, and barrel. And by the way, everything is a distribution curve. Get off of this horse pucky about scientists are always sweet, nice, reasonable people. That is not true. 10% of them are devils. 10% of them are angels, ought to be rewarded at the salt of the earth. But 10% of them have absolutely no ethics, absolutely playing nothing but the big monkey and power game, and absolutely your worst enemy in this area. glorious opportunity to, in other words, the vultures, or there's a better word for it, the wolves go around looking for the rabbits, and you're the rabbit and they're the wolf. So your next thing you get into is a big wolf-rabbit game with the scientists over on that 10%. So you face all of that. Meanwhile, you've got to go to the patent office. You get to the patent office, what are you looking at? This is impossible. This is perpetual motion. You say, well, the atoms have been doing this for 15 billion years. It's not perpetual motion, but it's just long-lasting. But they call it perpetual motion, and of course there is an unwritten law that anything that's perpetual motion shall not be even proved or looked at. You can't even get a serious consideration in the patent office. I speak as one who has submitted patents in this area. I know what I'm talking about. I've defended a couple of them. So what we have is a situation where the entire structure of science, industry, the organizations of science, and the patent office are already against you. If you can't get a patent, how can you license? So it's a real neat little thing. It's the old chicken and egg situation. If I had the chickens, I could get some eggs. If I had the eggs, I could get some chickens. This situation is designed so you never get chickens and you never get eggs. So the only thing you can do is to try to put your head down and continue with that and do one other thing, communication. Fortunately, we do have the internet. Sure, it's full of a lot of bad information. It's also full of a lot of good information. You just have to discriminate. So the other thing you have to do to have any chance at all is communicate, 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 communicate.